Okay, I want to welcome everyone to the second installment or edition of the Watchman's Guide newsletter, the newsletter for Worldwide Israel United. I am J.K. Alexander, your host, and friends call me Kirk. And for this newsletter, even though folks that are receiving the newsletter aren't taking the master classes, we did just get through covering most of the early parts of Genesis that are unknown in the master class. And so I'm going to give the newsletter folks some insight into what we're covering, and also the newsletter folks need this information as well. So we'll make it very short and sweet, but we'll just give you a little glimpse and a little synopsis of what we're covering about Genesis, because it's so very important. I did want to mention that I'm out here at Breckenridge Park, north of Dallas, to make a point on a Sunday morning that Sunday is not the true Sabbath. And I observe the true Sabbath, which is Saturday. So I can be out here working on Sunday, and it's no big deal. However, because I observe the true Sabbath does not mean that I want to abolish Sunday morning worship service. One of the great downsittings and downfallings of the Messianic movement among the Jews, the Messianic Jews and the Judeo-Christian movement, is yes, they want to observe the true Sabbath, which is good, and yes, they want to observe the holy days, the true holy days, which is good, but they go a little too far and start wanting to abolish Sunday morning worship and abolish Christmas. And they start to demonize Santa Claus like he's some terrible figure. No, there's no reason for that. All these things can coexist. And certainly, as we go through in the master class, we're diving deep. It's knowledge-based. I'm going to be calling the church on foot faults. But just because I call the church on foot faults does not mean that I am anti-traditional church. I am a traditional churchman. I grew up in the church. And we're never going to get rid of denominationalism now. We're just going to have to unify as denominations under the umbrella of Worldwide Israel. It's funny how things flip. First there was Israel, then there was no Israel, there was Christians. Now Christians are kind of fighting for their lives, and Israel, I think, will return to the fore and save Christianity, I believe. But despite all that, we are not going to try and abolish Christmas. We just need to keep Christmas and Thanksgiving and other little holidays in the proper perspective. And the way to do that is to observe the holy days properly, and once we do that, we'll see the difference. The holy days will be amazing. They will create a real change in the earth, and we will see that Christmas is just, it's a traditional religious holiday where we observe our Greco-Roman roots and our pathway to Western Christianity, but we will see the difference in the true holy days if we observe them properly, and our traditional religious days such as Christmas or Thanksgiving or whatever. There will be a difference. But we're not out to abolish anything, and we're certainly not out to abolish the Christian church because they are a little bit blind to their Hebrew heritage. No, that's not what we're about. We're going to unify all churches under Worldwide Israel United. If you have a pen handy, fine. If not, you can always pause this and rewind later. But these are scriptures that all occurred before the second sentence of the Bible, in that age prior to the age that we're currently living in. You can't really call it the first age because the earth goes back too far. We don't know what the first age is. The first age was before the age of the dinosaurs at some point. But the age prior to this one, 20, 30, 40,000 years ago, was a lot different than what scientists say it was. And these are the scriptures that tell us and give us a glimpse into those ages. Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. Then Jeremiah chapter 4, verses 23 through 28. Isaiah chapter 14, verses 12 through 17. Ezekiel chapter 28, verses 12 through 19. And all of those texts, that's a lot of text for a time that nobody knows about that occurred between the first and the second sentence of the Bible. So read through those verses in those chapters. And just understand and be aware of what you're reading, and know that all of that happened at a time when conventional wisdom is there was nothing on this earth but Neanderthals, Cro-Magnons, etc. Now, I've got 10 little talking points here, little things that we needed to just bring out and recover and about Genesis, and these will be good for the newsletter people as well, so we'll just go right through them very quickly. Number one, we talked a lot about the fact that prior to the second sentence of the Bible, because of these scriptures that we just talked about, we know that there were cities, sanctuaries, nations, a fruitful place, a civilization. Now, we didn't talk enough in the earlier modules in the master class about the birds, the beasts, the flora, the fauna, the rivers, the lakes, the oceans, the atmosphere. All of these things God and the angels had to go about and clean up and restore and make ready before, you know, the birds and the beasts could be brought forth, and certainly before man finally on the sixth day of the restoration, not the creation, the restoration. On the sixth day, God created man and woman. Now, that's number one. Number two, this was a Luciferian civilization in a very sort of a mini Luciferian age. We went the way of Lucifer for a long time there. And it became a vast angelic civilization that we don't even know how advanced we were. Certainly more advanced than we are right now. And that's just a fact that people have to get used to. Now, number three, God caused the flood. God caused much of the destruction of this earlier age, but God did not cause the darkness. God brought forth cutting winds that tore down sanctuaries. The flood tore down many things and destroyed many things, but the darkness and the contamination came from the war. That was from the Luciferians and the wars between God's people and Lucifer's people. And because of that darkness, that contamination, this was more than just a flood and a massive wind and cataclysm. There was contamination to be cleaned up. Now, in that earlier age, number 4 in our list, Lucifer and a third of his people were cast out of heaven. A third of the people of heaven were cast out because they followed Lucifer. That means they were cast out of heaven into the physical realm, and they were exiled into hiding in the physical realm. They cannot walk freely among the mortal creatures under the sun. They have to be in hiding. They are not to interact. How do you bind powerful, immortal, fallen beings like this? Well, you bind them with the promise of a far greater punishment, which is chains of everlasting darkness unto the end of the age, and then the lake of fire. They wouldn't even, if this further punishment is bestowed on them, they won't even get to follow their leader, their wicked leader in the final battles of the age. There's just everlasting darkness, chains, and then death. And that is a deterrent, even for very powerful immortal beings. And they know that God, the Zun, his flying creatures, and the chief princes among the angels, they can enforce this. There are already angels that are further bound and will be bound in chains of darkness until the end, and then will die. So they know. And for the most part, but these are wicked beings, and they do press the envelope, and they do contaminate. They know that God is merciful, and they work it. Number 5, the days in Genesis were not 24 hours. Some may have been a century, some may have been 5 centuries. But what God did was he had various projects that are described very specifically in the Bible. And just like a person today, he would work on those projects until those tasks were finished, and then he would call it a day. And whether that was 1,000 years or 500 years or 200 years, They were not 24-hour days, and they probably were not even equal increments. It was just God was working on things, and when he got through with something, he called it a day. And there ended up being 7 of them. And he rested on the 7th day. And we don't know how long he rested. But we have to remember, he had to clean up contamination. He had to clean up oceans, rivers, the land. He had to clear up the atmosphere so that the stars and the sun and the moon could appear. So the animals and all of that, by the time they came along, we were probably 3,000 years into this restoration. By the time man was made on the 6th day, 4,000 years of restoration had probably been going on by God and the angels of this earth. And I would assume that man was made and women were made on this earth, and they divided into tribes and hunted and gathered and made villages and populated the various lands, Nod, Eden, Censure, for probably at least 5 centuries before Adam and Eve were made. So the 7th day was probably about 500 years long while God rested between making man and woman and calling it very good, and then making Adam and Eve as intermediaries, the high priest and priestess, intermediaries between God and the tribes. Now, number 7, God intentionally blotted out the memory of the first age. Moses was not allowed to write about it extensively. Many centuries later, with the prophets, just a few centuries before Jesus, God finally started parting the veil and giving these last greatest of the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, a glimpse into the prior age so that we would know where we are, why we're here. We could get oriented much better than we had been throughout the ages. No one knows this. We can go back, unless we find the lost library of Alexandria, Egypt, we're probably not ever going to find any ancient writings about the prior age. It was blotted out. Moses didn't write about it. Noah didn't write about it. Nobody wrote about it. It was not known up until these later prophets started parting the veil, and God showed them glimpses of the prior age. That's number 7. Number 8, in the first age there were definitely, or the prior age, earlier ages of this earth, there were definitely flying craft. We had flying craft, my friends. It is simply axiomatic. There are megalithic sites all over this earth. Most of the experts say they're 7 to 9 centuries old. They could be 70 centuries old. These places could be 7,000 to 10,000 years old easily. I've visited them. These are virtually immortal sites. They will look the same in 1,000 years as they look right now. They're seamlessly blended into the natural landscape. They are made of solid megalithic stone. They are immortal structures. And one of the main aspects of virtually all these immortal structures, certainly many of them, various aspects of these megalithic structures are designed for aerial observation. They're designed to be viewed from the sky. So we know that in prior times, in ancient times, prior ages, probably the age, mostly in the age prior to this one, but those fallen ones still exist. And if they still exist, their flying craft still exists. But we know that at some point flying craft existed, because you do not make things for aerial observation if you've got no way to fly up there and observe them. So it's just axiomatic. Archaeology has proven that there were flying craft in earlier ages of this world. Now what we have to realize and keep in mind is that this was an angelic civilization. We had an unknown level of tech, an unknown level of science, an unknown level of wealth and trafficking and culture and civilization. It was amazing, I am sure. It was the mini Luciferian age. And the thing is, in this particular age, it was different than the prior ages that we had lived through. The prior ages had been more about life science, and the Luciferian age was more about branching out, buying and selling, and wealth building. I believe that we did make it to Mars as an angelic race, and in the physical realm, even for an angelic race, that is an amazing accomplishment, and it was probably an amazing amount of wealth and lucre for Lucifer if he owned the property rights of the world of Mars. The trafficking back and forth, and I think a trade war probably destroyed Mars, and those type of wars were breaking out, and violence was breaking out over buying and selling and wealth on the earth, which brought forth God's people to put an end to it, which brought forth an even greater war, which brought forth God to bring all the wars and the destruction to an end. Now, number 10, I just wanted to cover how much ground Genesis covers, because it covers a great deal of ground. It's what most people, all that most people know about the Bible is they know Genesis, because all the old known Bible stories are in Genesis, with the exception of Moses and Israel, and that's the other 4 books of the Torah, and that's what everybody knows of the Bible. So Genesis starts with the beginning of heaven and earth. It skips the prehistoric and prior ages. It picks up with tohu and bohu, without form and void. The earth is, the fruitful place has become a wilderness, a waste, and a desolation. And then it goes forward with a steady timeline. And we come to Adam, and after Adam, Cain is exiled, Abel is killed, so Adam has another son, Seth, and that begins again the high priest line, though it was a defrocked order. At this point, they had been expelled from the garden. But from Adam and through Seth, we come to Enoch. And Enoch also was in Genesis. From Enoch, his great-great-great-grandson, or great-great-grandson, was Noah. And that too is in Genesis. The whole story of Noah and the flood and the ark and the animals and all is in Genesis. And after the flood, Noah had a son named Seth. One of his, I think his grandson was Eber, and Eber's great-great-grandson was Abram, and he was Abraham, and was the father of Isaac. Took Isaac up on Mount Moriah, almost sacrificed him. God stayed his hand, showed him the ram in the bushes, and chose Abraham to be the father of faith. And from Abraham came Isaac, from Isaac came Jacob and Esau. Jacob traded Esau a bowl of soup for his birthright, and then cheated him out of his blessing by deceiving his father, blind Isaac, for the blessing. So he got the blessing and the birthright from his elder brother Esau, and then hightailed it out of Canaan and went to Laban. Many years later, he came back with 12 sons. Those 12 sons sold one of their brothers into slavery down into Egypt. He was in the dungeons of Egypt until he was about 28 to 30 years old. Came out of the dungeons and became the prime minister of Egypt. The Pharaoh loved him. He had divined the Pharaoh's dreams. He had avoided the destruction of a famine. And during that famine, all of his brothers and his father, Jacob, or Israel as he's known, came down to Egypt to avoid the famine. And they were blessed and beloved and greeted with honor. The Pharaoh had Jacob bless him, which in ancient times the greater always blessed the lesser never blessed the greater, which means that Jacob, Israel, was considered the king of Canaan. He was an elder king. They were like Abram, Isaac, and Jacob were kind of like the Cartwrights of the Ponderosa, or the Bartleys of the Big Valley, only much more in their influence and their wealth and their rulership of the land. And so they go to Egypt. The Pharaoh is blessed by Jacob and gives Jacob and his 70 the land of Goshen to live in, and they go there and multiply and multiply and multiply. And Jacob finally dies, but he calls his sons together and blesses them all and gives them glimpses into their future, and then dies. And there is a massive memorial for Jacob, our forefather Israel, as all of Egypt and all of Canaan turned out for his memorial, and it was a week or so long. And they finally came back to Egypt, and then the book of Genesis tells us the story of Joseph dying in Egypt. Joseph of the multicolored dream coat, same Joseph. He finally dies in Egypt, one of the sons of Israel. The book gives the details of his death, and then that's finally the end of Genesis. But it started at the beginning of all things and ends finally with the death of Joseph in Egypt. And so that's going to conclude this portion of the newsletter. But I wanted to go over those things about Genesis, give you those scriptures about Genesis, even for the newsletter people, because you need to read through those scriptures that I noted. And just remember, as you're reading, all those things that exist that are talked about in those scriptures, the cities, the birds, the beast, the fruitful place, the nations, the hosts, the people, all those things were living and thriving on this earth before the second sentence of the Bible, before the earth became without form and void, a waste and a desolation. Thank you very much, Watchman. This is the Watchman's Guide, the newsletter for Worldwide Israel United. God bless you all, and I will see you all next month.